again. In today's video we're going to be looking at map visualizations within Planning Analytics Workspace. We're going to look at how to enable a visualization and then how to work with it. We're going to dive into some of the region names that you can and can't use, and that's going to include a couple that are not mentioned at all in the documentation. We're going to look at some of the error messages that sadly your users are going to receive. We're going to cover off what they mean and how to work around them. And throughout it all, I'll be covering off some of the topics and questions that I've been asked by users when they have been working with map visualizations. Now, when you have a cube view in Workspace and you go to the Change Visualization option, it's quite intelligent in presenting to you which charts you can and can't use, and it does that based on how you've laid out your dimensions in the view. Now, in order to enable a map visualization, you need to have a single dimension in the rows, and that needs to be something that represents your geographic regions. Now, ideally you want a single dimension in the columns, a measures dimension, but you can actually nest dimensions here, although a map chart will only show you up to 3 measures or combinations of elements at a time, and it actually gets quite confusing once you get up to 3 different measures. So here we'll start with just a single measure. Now, what we also need to do is inform the system that that dimension we have in our rows is in fact a geographic dimension. And we do that through the use of the control cube called dimension attributes. Now, according to the documentation, this control cube should be created automatically when you open up your TM1 server in either Performance Modeler or Planning Analytics Workspace. Now, as we can see here, I am in Planning Analytics Workspace, but I do not have the dimension attributes cube available to me. So it seems that that doesn't quite work. However, we've got a simple workaround in place, which is we just use this TI process here to create that cube for us. And immediately when we run this, the cube is there and it is available to be used. And immediately afterwards, we can delete this process again, as we won't need it anymore. If you do need to use a process like this, you can find the code here, will be on our website, and you can find a link to that in the comments on this video. Now, within this dimension attributes cube, there's a dimension type measure, and what we need to do is simply specify geography against our dimension. Now, in my application, what I've actually done is created an alternative hierarchy, as I didn't want to use the business unit dimension that I already had. It contained too many elements that didn't represent geographic areas, so it didn't make sense to use that. However, although my alternative hierarchy does show up in the dimension attributes cube, if I specify geography against that hierarchy itself, it doesn't actually apply anything. I instead need to specify geography against the parent dimension. Now, hopefully that's something that IBM will change in the future, because it would be nice to specify which hierarchies can be used in the visualizations and which ones can't. But once we've done that, we don't need to refresh anything. We can just go to our cube view, and then straight away the map visualization option is available, and when we choose that, we are presented with a map. Now, when you're working with a map visualization, the one most important thing to have in place is a good quality geographic dimension. And what I mean by that is that the maps work with predefined areas in place that have specific names associated with them. So you need to use the right name for it to know that you're talking about a certain area. Now, if you go to the documentation, there is a map reference info section that I will provide a link to, and this lists out all the different names that you can use, and they're separated out into different levels. So at the highest level you have continent, then you have sub-region, country and province. Now, what you want to have a think about is which ones you're going to use. Maybe you're going to use all 4 different levels, maybe you're only going to look at countries, maybe you're going to use a combination of them. Now, what you might also find is that each different element might have different possible names. For example, the country of the Ivory Coast has 85 different names associated with it. Now, that might be the name in different languages. It might also be an ISO code instead of a name. Now, what you need to think about is that Ambiguity is a possibility. Now, the way the world has developed, we haven't been very unique with the names that places have been given. So, for example, if you're working with a large company that operates in multiple different countries and you're going to go down to the province level, you are definitely going to find some ambiguity. There are multiple countries that separate their regions out with just provinces called North, for example. Or if you're working in the United States and Asia, you might be in a position where you need to use the country, Georgia, but also the US state, Georgia. Now, you can't have both of them in your system because it will be ambiguous. So you need to holistically think about what you want to include and then decide which names you're going to use. So to avoid the Georgia issue, you might keep the name Georgia for the US state, but you might use ISO codes of 2-character nature or 3-character nature for your country codes. Now here we see an example of what happens when you do have an ambiguous element in place. Now I'm working with ISO country codes, so Germany has ended up with the characters DE. Now it turns out that the United Arab Emirates, one of the other supported values for its name, is also DE. So if I just view the element DE, Workspace does not know which one I'm talking about, so it returns this error message saying it's an ambiguous element. Now the way that it works is if I view DE alongside other country codes of similar nature, so for Europe, then it works out by looking around it which DE I was talking about, so it will still display it to me. But I need to be very careful thinking about how I inform my users that this will work. For example, they may have all the European countries listed by default, but there's a possibility that they have suppress zeros turned on and they're looking at an intersection where Germany is the only one that has data. In that case, they will get the ambiguous element error. So they need to be aware of the possibility that that might happen and know how to work around it, which is simply a case of always making sure that there are other elements displayed at the same time that will tell the system which DE we are talking about. Now another possible error here is if I don't have the correct element names in place. Now the way the map visualization works, it will have a look at the elements that you have for your regions and it wants at least 80% of them to be something it recognises. So if I have 10 elements, 7 of them are correct and 3 in this case are spelt incorrectly, it will tell me that it can't present me the map chart because not enough data is viable. However, on the other hand, if I have 9 elements that are spelt correctly and 1 has a slight error, the map visualization will display, and it displays perfectly fine apart from it's only showing me 9 different regions and I don't know which one it's not showing. So you need to be very careful about making sure you have the correct elements in place, because otherwise you could end up missing data without even being aware that it's happening. Now one question that I've been asked a couple of times is, can we also display percentages alongside the values on our maps? And the answer is yes, sort of. Now when you work with just one element in your measures dimension, so in your columns, what you just get is this simple map visualization with the darker colour representing a higher value and the lighter colour representing a lower value. Now that is quite easy to understand, but we only see one value displayed if we click. Now, if I want to also put percentages in, I can do this by using a second element in the column dimension. So in this case, I've done a create calculation within Workspace where I've just displayed as a percentage of the parent. And this does, if I right click, show the percentage beside it, but it does it by displaying 2 different things on the map. So this second thing is the black circular dots that we see in place. Now the larger the dot indicates a higher value and a smaller dot indicates a lower value. Again, relatively easy to understand, but when we start displaying two things on the map together it can get a little bit complicated. But in this case I'm essentially displaying the same value, so the users don't too much need to think about the size of the dot. They can just look at the colour and use the dot to provide them a percentage when they click on it. Now while we're on that subject, we are allowed up to 3 elements in place within our measures or our columns, so when we add a third one, what we see happen is instead these black dots change to a colour scale. So now what we have is the colour of the region is defining our first element, the size of the dot is indicating the second element, and now the colour scale of the dot is indicating our third element. So this works with the lighter scale of colour of the dot being the higher value and the darker scale of colour being the lowest value. Now personally I think when you're displaying all 3 of these on a map at the same time it makes it harder to immediately understand what you are looking at, and the whole point of a chart or a visualization should be that it makes your data easier to understand. Now I will not be using these. I think it makes it too complicated. Maybe I'll use 2 just to show that percentage. When it comes to these map visualizations and displaying your data at a province level, not all countries have been created equally. For example, if I want to work with the United States or Australia, they're very easy to understand, clear defined borders for the regions, and I can see each one clearly. Now, when I move over to the United Kingdom, we have 232 different provinces specified in a relatively small, oddly shaped map. Now, that just makes it very hard to see some of the smaller areas. So for example, Nottingham exists within Nottinghamshire. Now trying to see the difference between those, and particularly if it's a similar value and they're scaled the same, it can get very difficult to just click in the area you want, for example. Now I did promise that we would cover some regions that were not listed within the documentation, and thankfully this one comes as a benefit to fixing this problem a little bit. Now it does not make any mention of Scotland, England, Northern Ireland or Wales existing in either the province or country level. However, they do exist and they work. So what you can do is the same thing I've done here and add them in between the country and province level. So when I drill down, I go from GB into Scotland, and then I see the provinces under Scotland. And when I do that, because I'm only looking at province names that exist within Scotland, it just shows me a map of Scotland. So it makes it slightly larger on the screen and a little bit easier to see what we're looking at. Now while we're on this subject, I should probably also mention that there are sadly some region names that are listed that don't work. Now the ones specifically that I've found here are again in the United Kingdom, so we see that there are multiple different provinces within London listed here. Now all of those seem to have this other supported value of Greater London, and I was very hopeful for this because I would have rather shown the data of Greater London as a whole because it would be easier to display on the map. Now sadly, when I enter this as an element and view my visualization, I get the error message that it is an unknown element and it doesn't work. And we have the same thing happen within the region of Greater Manchester, although it's not actually listed as Greater Manchester, it's Manch', but again it's the same issue that is not recognised. Now we'd love to know of any other regions you've found that do work and aren't listed, or don't work and are listed, so if you found any of those, please mention them in the comments. It would be great to get that information out there for other people as well. Now if you've made it to this stage in the video, Thank you for watching. I know I promised these would be a quick tip series and it has been quite a long time, but when it comes to map visualizations I could have spoken for hours and still had more information to give. Now I understand that probably throughout this video I've made it sound quite complicated, but to be honest it's not. If you just get going, you will get there. And when it comes to map visualizations, if you have the data available, they can be a very powerful asset for how to view your data.